All right, let's talk about what thinking mechanically is, all right? Thinking mechanically is about understanding the reasons and the processes, the where and the whys about what you're working on, all right? Um, it's kind of easy to sometimes remember rules about troubleshooting stuff or rules about, how you run a wet vent when it comes to plumbing. If we're talking plumbing, if we're talking HVAC, it might be easy to remember if I stick my lead between, this lead from the compressor. If I stick my meter leads from this leg of the compressor to this leg of the compressor and it's open, then there's something wrong with the compressor, right? That's pretty easy to do. You can remember these little facts and figures as you get up in the as you're going up through the trade, and you can get by. All right, you can get by. I've seen guys do it. But if you really want to be able to excel and you really want to be able to understand what you're doing, you've got to know why an answer is what it is. You got to know how that particular device works. You got to know the instructions for everything you install. You've got to know the manuals from the manufacturers. And you've got to understand the principles that govern all of those things. So, when it comes to those kinds of things, my favorite way to start that is to talk about how there's no such thing as cold. All right? Because there's not. And that's the first thing you should know if we're talking HVAC. When we're talking HVAC, you need to know that there's no such thing as cold. It helps you understand a lot of things about HVAC, especially heat pumps and things of that nature. But it also gets to some of the principles underneath the processes. So, these are the fundamentals. We're talking about thinking mechanically, and I end this with some resources that you can look at. And I want to come up with more of these. I really want to set up a web page that goes to a lot of resources on different fundamental topics or where to find information based on where you are, things like that. 'Cause sometimes the trick is just knowing where to find information, especially these days when Google's at your fingertips. You can learn a lot if you just know where to look. All right. There's no such thing as cold, right? Cold is the absence of heat. And when we're talking HVAC, what we're trying to do is move the heat. We're trying to move heat from one area to another, one way or the other. That's all we're doing with HVAC when we're talking about heating or cooling. Now, ventilation is obviously slightly different, right? Ventilation is providing fresh air to maintain good air quality or to, well, primarily maintaining good air quality, right? But when we're talking about heating or cooling, we're moving heat one way or the other. There's no way to just create heat out of thin air. We can burn fuels, right, to create heat, but that's just taking energy, right? Taking energy that's in that fuel gas already and converting that to heat. So heat is energy, okay? Heat is energy. Cold is the absence of heat. The only thing that's cold is negative 459.67 degrees Fahrenheit, which is absolute zero. That is where molecular movement stops. But once you get above that, now we have heat. Now we have heat, and there's heat to be moved. And cooling is moving heat where it is unwanted to somewhere it is unobjectionable. If we're cooling, we're just moving heat to somewhere where we don't want it to somewhere where we don't care that it's there. Generally, we're moving that heat from inside an indoor environment to outside that indoor environment, or in the house to the outside. We're taking the heat from in the house and moving it to outside the house. And heating is replacing heat where it's been lost. So during winter, right, there's much less heat outside during that time frame, and the heat in your house is going to want to escape outside the house. And it does that predictably in which we'll talk about, heat always moves from greater to lesser concentration. Heat tries to seek equilibrium. So we need to provide more heat where it has been lost, because heat will always go. And that goes into heat does not rise. Heat always seeks equilibrium. Heat will seek out where there is less heat. So if you have more heat inside than outside, then that heat will try and escape to the outside. If you have more heat outside than inside, that heat will try and get into the inside. All right. Heat always seeks equilibrium. Heat moves from greater concentration to lesser concentration. All right. Warm fluids, such as air. Air is a fluid, such as water. Water is a fluid. Tend to rise because it is lighter than a cooler fluid. So cooler fluids are more dense. Think about ice. Ice is a fluid that's gotten so cool that it is now turned into a solid. But if we warm that ice, it will become a liquid. If you have ice in a glass, the cooler water that as the ice melts and becomes a cooler fluid, that fluid will tend to sink to the bottom, and the warmer fluid will stay at the top. Think about an iced coffee. If you're ever drinking an iced coffee, right? If you're using a straw, you'll pull the watery, cold fluid from the bottom. But if you take the straw and move it to the top of the cup, then that warmer coffee will remain at the top. So unless you mix it up, then you will tend to have cool, watery coffee at the bottom and warm, richer coffee at the top. I personally prefer the warmer, richer coffee at the top, and I hate it when it gets down to the bottom where the ice has started to melt. But it's the same with the air in your house. The cooler air tends to chill at the bottom, and the warmer air tends to rise, which is why things like baseboard heat work, because the cool air tends to enter the baseboard heater and then rise to the top and then circulate by itself. So warm fluids tend to rise, but heat does not rise. One of my favorite things that ever happened, when I learned plumbing, okay. When I learned plumbing, they told me that when you're soldering a fitting, you should start at the bottom because heat rises, right? You should start soldering at the bottom of the fitting, especially on big fittings, because heat rises. So you want that heat to be concentrated on the bottom so that that heat will rise to the top of the fitting, and then you start putting the solder in the middle or towards the top of the fitting while keeping the torch. You warm the whole fitting, but you keep the torch near the bottom. That is a huge mistake, right? Because that's not how it works. Heat goes from greater concentration to lesser concentration. So no matter where you put that torch on that fitting, you're going to have the greatest concentration of heat at the place where the torch is touching. And that is where you want to feed the solder, because that's where the capillary action is going to take place to draw the solder in. So you want to move that flame around the fitting as you're applying the solder, so that with that hottest part where the torch is where that solder is going to tend to go into. And if you keep it in one spot too long, especially if you're soldering, you'll burn up the flux, and then you'll end up with a leak. We can talk about all the principles of soldering and brazing another day, but that's what I was taught. And as I learned, I realized that was one of the worst things I ever learned. And I actually, had guys test it. Me and a bunch of guys on a Reddit thread tested the whole theory one time just for fun to see if the heat would rise as you're heating up a piece of copper pipe. And of course, the heat doesn't rise. The heat flows from greater concentration to lesser concentration throughout the piece of pipe or the fitting. But anyway, it was a neat thing to be involved in, having some guy, in England proving that that the theory is correct just for fun. You know what I mean? Just proving little things scientifically just to make sure that your principles aren't incorrect. But anyway, that long story over, it's important to understand that heat does not rise. Okay, heat does not rise. Heat seeks equilibrium, moving from greater concentration to lesser concentration. But it's also important to understand that warm fluids do rise, because when you're talking about something like a water heater, when you have a broken dip tube, and you're not feeding the cold water to the bottom, even though that whole heater will get warm, that cold fluid will short cycle. But if you don't understand that short cycling is occurring, then you might think something else is going on because the cold fluid is bypassing. I don't know. Maybe that doesn't make sense. Maybe that's not the best example for this situation. But anyway, my rambling aside, that it's both things are important to understand. So there you go. All right, and thinking mechanically. So, with that being said, when I talk about thinking mechanically, what I'm talking about generally is really trying to imagine things using something that you already understand to help you understand something you may not. Okay? So, understanding that air is a fluid, thinking about water in that process may help you. Instead of thinking about the air moving, because it can be hard to picture air moving since it's invisible. Instead of trying to think about the air moving, try and think about if there was water there. What would the water do? How would you expect the water to behave in a duct, right? Because a duct is just a big pipe. It could be round, it can be square, it doesn't matter. It's just a place for the air to flow through. Okay? And a good example of this is, imagine if we used water in the refrigeration cycle, right? Some guys have a lot of trouble understanding the refrigeration cycle for whatever reason, and it's kind of this esoteric thing. These pipes, there's this fluid moving through these pipes, and what's it doing, and how are we moving heat, and what's happening there. And especially in the case of heat pumps, I don't know, people's mind melts sometimes when they think about the heat pump moving heat from outside to inside when it's cold outside. But remember, there's no such thing as cold, right? There's no such thing as cold. There's heat outside, even if it feels cold to us outside. So when people think about those processes, sometimes they get really bogged down in little details of what's going on. But if you're trying to understand the refrigeration cycle, let's pretend it was water in there. Okay, instead of this R22 or R410A, this refrigerant that we don't really understand what's going on and what's happening, what would a refrigeration cycle look like if the water was going through it? Okay, if it was water going through the cycle, how would it behave? When would it be steam? When would it be a liquid? All right, let me see what the next, nope, this isn't what I want to go. So I want to talk about that for a minute. Let me go to the previous one. Okay, so let's talk about what that would be, right? Well, the compressor is a vapor pump, so we would have to have steam inside the compressor, right? So there would be steam, water in the form of steam inside the compressor, and that steam would get pumped into the condenser, right? That steam would get pumped into the condenser, and as it goes through the condenser, the water would condense, right? Condensation. So basically, the steam gives off enough heat that it starts to turn into water. So we have a solid column of really hot water going to our metering device. So going from the condenser to the inside coil, we would have a solid column of water. The steam goes in the condenser to condense into water, and then the water flows inside to our indoor unit. So that's what we're doing. We're turning that steam into water in the condenser, right? And then when it gets to our metering device, what we're doing is we're pushing that water through a little hole like a sprayer, like a if you've ever been to one of those restaurants that have outdoor seating and they have those misters out there that drops the air temperature around the outdoor seating. That's what we're doing in the metering device. We're sending that water through a mister to spread it out real fast so that the temperature drops. Okay? So as that water goes through the metering device, it gets turned into a fine mist. All right? And that fine mist goes into the evaporator, and the air blows across the evaporator to pick up the to give up the heat to the evaporator to turn that mist into a cool steam. All right, so that water gets misted so that it can pick up all the heat from the inside quickly. Right, it picks up that heat very quick and turns into a cool steam. All right, so it's vapor, but it's cooler than it was before. So it picks up that heat until all that water turns back into steam, right? And then it gets sent back to the compressor. And again, the compressor is a vapor pump. So it has to all be steam when it gets back to the compressor, or will hurt the compressor. So and then when it goes in the compressor, it gets superheated again, like extra superheated, so that we can repeat the cycle. Because to be able to pick up or to be able to give off heat to the outside, that water has to be a higher temperature than it is outside. And to pick up heat from the inside, that water has to be a cooler temperature than it is inside. Okay, so that's why we have the compressor, simply to make the water hotter, right? Make the refrigerant, really, but in this case we're pretending it's water, right? It's going to make that steam hotter so that we're able to give off heat to the outside, because the heat has to move from one place to another. We're not cooling anything. We're trying to move the heat from inside to outside. And the only way to do that is to make sure that the temperatures are right so that can happen. So that's the purpose of the compressor, really. Interestingly enough, if you've never heard of one thing that would be interesting for you to study is a gas-fired air conditioner. All right? You can use natural gas to power the refrigeration cycle instead of the compressor. It's a perfectly viable way of doing it. Now, they're uncommon for a multitude of reasons that are outside the scope of this lesson. But you can have a gas-fired air conditioner. So that would be something, if it would help you, you can look up. Maybe I should add that to this lesson one day. But the point is that we don't have to use a compressor, but it's just a good way of achieving our goal. So again, our compressor has hot steam in it, right? It pumps that, it makes the vapor hot steam. That hot steam, which has to be hotter than the outside, gives off heat to the outside until it turns into water. That water goes into our metering device, which mists the water into the evaporator and turns it into a saturated vapor, a misty vapor, right? And that misty vapor, the temperature of that misty vapor drops really fast, and then goes into the evaporator. And then since the temperature drops so fast by lowering the pressure, right? Because that's the other thing that's happening. We're lowering the pressure at the metering device because we lowered the pressure of that water really quick and turned it into a mist. It's going to pick up heat from the inside, and that heat from the inside is going to turn it into a steam again. And that steam is going to go back to the compressor to be compressed so that pressure goes up and the temperature goes up so that we can give off heat to the outside again. And as we give off the heat to the outside, we go through the metering device again to pick up the heat again. So we go steam to water to saturated vapor to steam to superheated steam to water to saturated vapor to steam to superheated steam. And that's basically the process, right? So next time you're thinking about the refrigeration cycle and we talk about it in more technical terms, right? We talk about it what the actual technical terms are supposed to be for a refrigeration cycle. If you're having trouble picturing it, picture it as water. And that's thinking mechanically, right? Making sure that you understand what's happening in that process. And then once you can picture that process occurring, um, using that picture in your head to say, okay, well, what would happen if um, my condenser didn't the air wasn't going across the condenser, right? I had a dirty condenser. What would happen then? Being able to picture that and go, okay, well, I would have superheated steam going through the condenser, but it wouldn't pick up heat. And if it didn't pick up heat, it would stay steam. So if it stayed steam and it went into the metering device, then it wouldn't turn into a mist. It would just stay steam. And since it would still be a hot steam, it would probably be too hot to pick up heat from the inside. And then we'd repeat that process, but we wouldn't be picking up heat from the outside because we weren't giving off heat to the outside. So it would kind of be locked. It'd be locked, staying steam the whole time, and it would never pick up in or give off any heat. So being able to picture those things and picture what's happening in the cycle and picture when the cycle fails, picture what happens when the cycle fails, that's thinking mechanically. And being able to do that with other things, being able to do that with understanding how a VRF system works or why our pipe has to be a certain way, or what happens if you put too many fittings in a pipe and pressure drops. What happens if my duct isn't sized properly? What happens when the air is moving through the duct and there's not enough places for it to go? All these things, as you learn to apply what you understand to what you don't understand so that you can begin to understand it. That's trying to use knowledge you have to gain more knowledge. And that's thinking mechanically. That's understanding the mechanics of what's going on in a process. All right. So let's talk about some of the actual things that you need to understand. Let's talk about some more principles just to kind of extend this topic, right? So a British thermal unit. The British thermal unit is the amount of energy needed to raise the temperature of 1 pound of water by 1 degree Fahrenheit. Okay, so that's a BTU. Um, the latent heat of vaporization, right? So the heat that turns, so this is a sensible change in temperature, right? BTU, you're going to have a sensible change. So when you change the temperature of something, that's sensible heat. Okay, so as the temperature changes in a fluid, so as we raise the temperature of water, right, we're adding heat to the water, and it's going up. But once we go to get to steam, right, once we're taking that water to try and turn it into steam, then we have to add more BTUs, but we don't gain any more sensible temperature. We get that water to 212 degrees Fahrenheit, right, where it starts turning into steam. And as that water is boiling, it doesn't go over 212 degrees Fahrenheit. So if you put a thermometer into a pot of boiling water, it will stay at 212 degrees. If you're at atmospheric pressure, that temperature of that water will never rise above 212 degrees, because the only way it can get above 212 degrees is by turning into steam. It has to turn into steam first. It has to go through the latent heat of vaporization, and that is the amount of heat needed to change state from a fluid to a gas. And for water, that latent heat of vaporization is about 970 BTUs. So we have to add, for every pound of water, we're going to have to add another 970 BTUs to turn that water into steam. All right. It might not be actually a pound, but for purposes of presentation, right? It takes 970 BTUs to take that water from water to steam, and then once it turns into steam, we can add more sensible heat again, right? We can start to be able to raise the temperature of that steam over 212 degrees Fahrenheit, but that water will never go above 212 degrees Fahrenheit until it's turned into steam. And during this process, the sensible measured temperature does not change. Just like I said, the water will stay 212 degrees Fahrenheit that until that process is complete. The other thing we got is the latent heat of condensation. Same thing. If we're trying to go from steam into back into water, that's the amount of heat loss needed to change state from a gas to a fluid. So for water, again, we're talking about 970 BTUs, and during this process, the measurable temperature does not change. So if we could trap some steam inside of a box, right, and distill it, that's not really the right word, but condense it back into water. So if we had a bucket of steam, right, and we put a lid on it, it would be 212 degrees until it all turned into water, and then the temperature would start to drop again. Okay, but the heat needs to be released from it. The heat needs to go away before that temperature. Those 970 BTUs have to be dispersed into the environment around it before it will turn into water again, before it will finish condensing. And that's the same thing in our refrigeration cycle. And that's part of what makes the refrigeration cycle work, is we're constantly keeping a refrigerant. What makes a refrigerant a good refrigerant is being able to go in between those states and having a large latent heat of vaporization and a large latent heat of condensation, because we're turning it into steam in the evaporator, and we're turning it into water inside the condenser, and those changes of state have to pick up a lot of BTUs. We're trying to move 12,000, 24,000, 36,000 BTUs, and to move that amount of heat, we need something that that changes state, right? When it changes state, it picks up and loses a lot of BTUs changing that state. All right. So there's some definitions here of just random stuff that are good for you to learn. Heat is the amount of, I take that back. Here's some good definitions here of how I think of things. Okay, this is how I think of them, and it helps me. So sometimes it's good to understand the technical definition of something, right? But when you're thinking mechanically, it's better to have your own definition of something that helps you understand what that definition really means. So just knowing off the top of your head the proper definition for heat, or the proper definition for superheat, or whatever, that may not help you as much as coming up with your own definition that reminds you why that word is what it is, right? Reminds you what that term does, right? So for heat, my way of thinking of it is the amount of energy in a substance. It's just the amount of energy. Heat is energy. Heat moves from greater concentration to lesser concentration, and it's just energy, and we're just moving energy. Okay. Cold is just the absence of heat, and it occurs up at approximately 460 degrees Fahrenheit. So we can describe something as cold because we feel cold, but really cold is the absence of heat. So there's no such thing as cold until you hit 460 degrees Fahrenheit, negative 460 degrees Fahrenheit. Otherwise, we're just dealing with less heat or more heat. Cooling is the process of moving heat from where it is unwanted to where it is unobjectionable. Heating is the process of adding heat to an area or substance. Subcooling is the amount of sensible heat removed past the latent heat of condensation, ensuring the substance is all liquid. Superheat is the amount of sensible heat added past the latent heat of vaporization, ensuring that the substance is all vapor. Latent heat for refrigerants is the amount of heat needed to change state, or it's the hidden heat. It cannot be measured with the thermometer. Latent heat for comfort cooling, so when we're talking about removing latent heat in a house, we're talking about humidity. Humidity is that latent heat. Trying to remove the moisture from the air is removing latent heat in the air. So when we're talking about removing latent heat in a building, we're generally talking about removing humidity. Thinking mechanically is using processes you're already knowledgeable about to understand more complex processes. Use all your resources to your advantage. HVAC and plumbing, for that matter, are vast and complex trades, but HVAC particularly so. So use all your resources to your advantage to understand as many things about your trade as possible. There's always something new to learn. You know, guys say all the time, try and learn something new every day. I always try and learn something new every single day. If you're working on something and there's something you don't understand about it, use that time that you're working on that thing to understand something better. And the information necessary to understand your trade is all around. Use the internet, read, take classes, use every resource you got, including me or people you know. I use the resources around me all the time. There's plenty of people I know that I learn from and ask questions. You should do the same. Some resources that you should keep an eye out for. Go to ACCA's website, Air Conditioning Contractors of America. They have great books on the trade and they're the source of most of the standards for residential products. ACCA is an extremely good resource for things. So visit their website, look around. International Code Council, or if you're on the more western side of the country, the Uniform Plumbing Standards or Uniform Mechanical Standards, UMC, UPC, the uniform codes, basically. Use the uniform codes or the international codes to your advantage, and make sure you understand building, mechanical, residential, and energy conservation codes for construction. If we're talking HVAC, you want to those are the codes you'll need to know at a minimum, right? Those are the minimum codes you need to know and understand. You know, you can get rid of residential if you don't do much residential. You might be able to swing by without building if you don't do much commercial. But mechanical and energy conservation codes are critical, and then the other codes that go hand in hand with the trade are critical. SMACNA for duct construction standards, and for especially for commercial construction. A lot of times the codes dictate residential duct construction, but SMACNA is the universal standard for duct construction when it comes to commercial buildings. Manufacturer's references, installation guides, service manuals, and other information. And you know, we're not just talking about equipment. If you've never read the installation manual for the PVC piping you install for condensate, Charlotte and other manufacturers have great installation manuals for their PVC piping. There are installation instructions on the back of your cans of glue. There are manuals for properly brazing using your particular torch. There are manuals for the flue pipes you install. There are manuals for everything. Everything you put in, somebody's come up with a book on it. All right? And if there's no book on it, I'm probably working on it. So, read everything. Read absolutely everything. And if you have trouble reading, practice more. I mean, especially in HVAC, you've got to be able to read. You've got to be able to understand what you're looking at. So, read everything you can get your hands on, or watch videos on everything you do. You know, if you don't read well, I'm sure somebody's made a video on it. So, find a video on it. Read the manual, corroborate resources, do everything you can to understand every installation guide for everything you do. And if you do that on a regular basis, if you make sure you understand the user's manual for the gauges you use and everything, you'll be in a good position to be able to think mechanically about other things down the road. ACHR News for HVAC is a great website. Great technical articles, information on new products, and then HVACschool.com, YouTube, forums, Stay engaged with the community. Learn more information that way. You can meet new people that can give you new perspectives, and there's always something new to learn. Browse the HVAC Reddit, or browse the HVAC school forum, or browse um, uh, anything you can get your hands on. Try and find a community that keeps you engaged. That's the best advice I can give you. You know, just stay engaged, stay learning, um, and think mechanically. And if you can do that, you'll be in a very good position down the road to excel in the trade. Thanks for watching. If you like the content, give it a like. I'll try and put more up there as soon as possible. Try and finish up some of these classes that I'm doing, and get more information out there to help you guys. But as you're learning, as you're doing things, remember to think mechanically.